Immediately staking claim in the center, d4 opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, initiating a strategic struggle for central dominance. Central pawns now clash, immediately establishing a symmetrical pawn structure and setting the stage for a positional struggle for dominion over the core of the board. Seizing the center's initiative, this pawn thrust challenges Black's central grip, promising a dynamic struggle for space and piece activity. Black decides to seize the center's space immediately, but temporarily surrenders pawn tension for queenside expansion. Clearing the way for the bishop to support a pawn advance creates central pressure and opens diagonals. Developing the knight here opens lines for the queen and bishop, actively contesting the center's influence. Recapturing the pawn with the bishop enhances piece activity and prepares to castle, a solid foundational choice. Solidifying the pawn structure now prepares for queenside development, anticipating a symmetrical setup. Developing a knight to its natural outpost, controlling the central squares and preparing for kingside castling, reinforces White's central control. Challenging White's pawn center directly, this play ignites immediate central tension and seeks to free Black's queenside. Developing the queen here prepares castling and supports the central pawn structure, aiming for a comfortable middle game coordination. Black resolves the central pawn tension, opening lines and potentially inviting a knight sortie to e4 later. Reclaiming the pawn opens crucial central files for your pieces. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies the king's safety and prepares for castling, while also offering a pawn to potentially recapture on d4. Castling secures the king and prepares for an active middle game by connecting the rooks. Securing the monarch behind a pawn wall signals a commitment to safety, a prudent step in this sharp queen's gambit accepted. Developing the knight efficiently shores up the center's pawn structure and prepares to contest control of the d5 square. Developing the knight to its natural outpost on c6 prepares to contest the center and potentially challenge White's queen. Unblocking the queen's rook and preparing to contest the open d-file offers White good central influence. Liberating the knight to a more active square, aiming to disrupt White's central control and potentially pressure the queen. Relocating the bishop to d3 bolsters its influence on the queenside, aiming to prevent Black's knights from finding comfortable outposts. Black aims to reinforce the d5 pawn and prepare for queenside expansion, creating dynamic pawn structure play. Injecting knight pressure on the queenside, disrupting Black's coordination and opening attacking lanes. Developing the bishop to b7 prepares for a potential queenside expansion and aims to challenge White's central control. Positioning the queen to support the bishop and potentially threaten, the kingside offers more attacking avenues. Asserting control over the c-file creates an immediate challenge to White's pawn structure. Shifting the queen aims to exploit potential weaknesses around Black's castled king, creating active attacking possibilities. Preparing a kingside pawn storm to dislodge White's knight, aiming for a dynamic imbalance. Targeting Black's king shelter, this bishop sacrifice opens lines for potential future attacks, disrupting Black's pawn structure and posing immediate king safety concerns. Challenging the dominant bishop opens up dynamic possibilities, but it sacrifices kingside safety. Unmasking the queen offers little, allowing Black to develop a more active piece play and seize initiative. Relocating the knight to g7 prepares for potential rook lifts and secures its position for future maneuvers. Securing the c-file with this rook is crucial for future pawn advances and piece activity on the queenside. Fortifying the queenside pawn structure, this aims to solidify Black's position and prepare for potential pawn advances. Asserting central control and preparing a knight outpost. Exchanging the bishop simplifies the position, but relinquishes the crucial light-squared control Black had hoped to maintain. Securing the central queen offers a flexible platform for future operations, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the kingside while maintaining a watchful eye on Black's developing pieces. This passive deployment on the e-file surrenders crucial space, and does little to contest white's imposing central pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines and creates dynamic imbalances, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure. Reclaiming the king's square offers some relief, but the king now feels the pressure from white's active pieces. Securing the queenside and preparing a kingside assault now begins in earnest. Initiating a slow advance to secure the rook's position, preparing for potential pressure along the open files. Opening the central files now dramatically increases pressure on black's somewhat exposed king. Liberating the queen from its defensive post on d6 now allows it to survey the queenside and potentially participate in central play. A curious repositioning, aiming to re-establish queenside pressure while potentially sacrificing queenside initiative. The d5 pawn's advance shatters the central blockade, opening diagonals for black's pieces. Opening the king's defense, white gambles on disrupting black's pawn structure and creating attacking chances. Challenging the center and aiming for a queen sortie to stir up the game. Asserting control of the central squares, this checks the king and forces a difficult decision on where to reposition the royal piece. Fortifying the king's immediate vicinity and preparing a defensive pawn chain against further central pressure. Liberating the knight to the outpost, this move sharpens the attack on black's weakened kingside. The rook's relocation opens a vital diagonal for white's queen, but the d-file now becomes a potential battleground. Dominating the central files and challenging black's pawn weaknesses becomes the paramount objective now. Sacrificing the exchange to open lines and disrupt white's coordination feels like a desperate gamble. Exploiting the open file with tempo, this piece aggressively targets enemy positions. Reinforcing the queen's control over the central squares is crucial given the exposed king. Simplifying to a favorable endgame by exchanging queens now looks quite promising for white. Simplifying the material exchange opens the door to a more manageable endgame, where black's rook becomes active. A bold pawn grab, but watch for counterplay. Kingside activity now feels quite muted. Initiating a sortie of the knight towards the open central files, seeking to activate its dormant potential. Fortifying the central knight solidifies white's initiative on the open d-file. Reclaiming the central square with the knight signals a shift toward active piece play and potential tactical skirmishes. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, preparing to contest the open files and gain space for the rooks. Bishops often seek out open diagonals. This one aims for the kingside's vulnerability. Prioritizing king safety now becomes paramount as white prepares to bolster its structure. The rook now eyes the open file, activating a dormant piece into the fray. Exploring the kingside further, the knight aims to control crucial central squares and prepare for a potential attack. Repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal to pressure the knight and prepare for potential pawn advances. Repositioning the knight to bolster the central control and prepare for potential breakthroughs. Re-establishing the bishop pair, this retreat looks to exploit potential weaknesses on white's queenside. A bold bid for queenside space and potential pawn thrusts. The knight's bold plunge to d3 disrupts the queenside structure and seeks active outpost squares. Activating the rook on the third rank unifies the white pieces and prepares for infiltration into black's weakened queenside. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, eyeing weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Relocating the king to the side opens up potential for piece activity and avoids being a target on the central files. Aids the rook's advance towards central influence and prepares for potential pawn pushes. Unlocking space on the queenside, this pawn advance aims to disrupt black's rook coordination and gain vital maneuvering room. Trading the bishop for the knight on e3 simplifies, clearing a path for the rook to become active along the now open d-file. Reclaiming the outpost for your knight immediately strengthens the center and prepares further pawn advances. Reuniting the rooks for their final dance across the board to contest key squares. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank injects immediate attacking pressure, creating a dynamic imbalance. Focusing on consolidating the kingside, black allows white's rook to become more active on the 7th rank. Activating the rook here allows it to dominate the 7th rank and pressure black's weak pawns. Flipping the script, this pawn advance challenges white's consolidated setup and seeks to disrupt their positional advantage. Boldly challenging black's pawn structure opens avenues for white's rook and potential passed pawn. Sacrificing pawns to activate the bishop and gain central space, a bold attempt to complicate the endgame. Opening up a new avenue for the rook, this gambit aims to infiltrate black's position and exploit the exposed pawn structure. Opening the file offers counterplay against the isolated pawn. Repositioning the rook to the 5th rank exerts pressure on black's scattered pawns and prepares to contest the open files. Awkwardly retreating, the knight sidesteps the immediate threat, but forfeits crucial central influence, leaving black defensively reactive. Activating the knight to eye vulnerable squares and prepare for a pawn push. Repositioning the king for potential pawn pushes or supporting its rooks is a sensible endeavor in this endgame scenario. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank creates an immediate threat to black's poorly defended pawns and limits their piece mobility. Shifting the king's focus to the central pawns, aiming to activate it for the approaching endgame skirmishes. A bold march for the king, aiming to galvanize the forces on the kingside and challenge black's piece activity. Exploring new avenues, the knight ventures to c5, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Forcing the king onto a colored square, simplifying into a winning endgame. The monarch seeks refuge on the kingside, hoping to bolster the defensive structure. Seizing the rook with the king offers a substantial material advantage, but be mindful of counterplay on the queenside. The knight's journey to the queenside promises a fight for the open files, but risks isolation. Reorganizing pieces toward the center, this knight aims to improve its positional standing and support future pawn advancements. This pawn push aggressively claims central space, seeking to destabilize white's coordinated pieces. This pawn push injects life into white's kingside, aiming to disrupt black's well-placed knight and open lines for potential attacks. Establishing a defensive pawn chain anchors the kingside, preparing to contest the open files ahead. Activating the knight to a central outpost now becomes a primary objective. Injecting this pawn forward is a desperate attempt to create queenside counterplay before white's knight can consolidate a dominant outpost. Opening a decisive diagonal for the knight, aiming to infiltrate enemy territory and disrupt black's defensive structure.